Hello everybody, today I would like to talk to you about my mono blue Thieves deck. Essentially, you can see that this deck is focused on stealing our opponent's permanents and playing with them. Of course, this deck is a really casual one. It's built according to Swedish banned and restrict list, and it's not very powerful, but it can be a lot of fun, and you get to cast some of the cards that you have never seen before, I'm sure. So, first of all, let's talk about the threats in this deck, and there aren't many of them. This is a playset of Lord of Atlantis. Playset of Lord of Atlantis and Dance of Many and Clone to assemble quite an impressive army of Lord of Atlantis sometimes. Of course, Lord of Atlantis is good just on his own, because this is a 2-2 or 3-3 or 4-4 or even bigger creature with Island Walk. And we do know that blue is probably the best color in old school Magic, so very often your opponent will have an island. Dance of Many is a card that I feel is underplayed. Of course, it doesn't need any introduction, but I'm still sure that you don't see it very often. The good thing about this card is that it costs only 2 to cast, and very often it can just neutralize our opponent's creature. For example, if we decide to copy our opponent's Serra Angel, then very often our opponent will just attack us and we will trade these creatures, but your creature will cost only 2 mana. Then, speaking of threats, I don't really consider Sage of Latnam as a threat, but it can be a nice utility card and can sometimes be enhanced with Transmigrant, so it can be a 2-3. But the best thing about him, of course, is that you can sacrifice artifacts, and you've got a lot of artifacts in this deck. So, why is there a playset of Ashnod's Transmigrants? Of course, the playset is here for this very nice synergy. If we make our opponent's creatures into artifact creatures, then we can easily steal them with steal artifact. And this may not seem like a good deal, because this is 5 mana and 2 cards for our opponent's card, but on the other hand, Control Magic itself, I think, is not a really fair card. It's very powerful. I know that many people don't play it main deck, but since here is the main idea, and we only have the backup plan sometimes, so if our opponent doesn't have a lot of creatures, then we will try to take this out after sideboarding. Anyway, getting back to these, this is still a good deal. If our opponent has some very powerful creatures, you will trade 2 cards for 1 card, but you will also take away your opponent's card, and essentially this makes it 2 for 2, not 2 for 1, as you might think. Transmigrant, of course, can also be used to pump our Lord of Atlantis, or maybe pump our Sage of Latnam, or some other stolen creature, so it's not a completely useless card. If it does feel useless, you can easily sacrifice it to Sage of Latnam. Then we've got 1 Follower Stone. It's just there for a little bit of mana acceleration. I don't think that more is required. Then, speaking of stealing our opponent's permanents, we've got Gauntlets of Chaos. Only 1 copy, obviously, because this card costs 10 mana to cast and activate, which is of course a lot. But the good thing is that you can even steal your opponent's land. So you can exchange your island for your opponent's, say, Library of Alexandria, or maybe Maze of Ith, which I sometimes did. Or maybe you can choose an artifact that you want and trade your Mox, or Follower Stone, or something else for your opponent's best artifact. And the same can be done with creatures as well. Another card that is similar, meaning it provides for some unfair trades, is Juxtaposed. Juxtaposed is a card that I think not many of you have seen, and even if you have, then you certainly haven't played it at all. So what happens with this card is that you exchange the creatures that you control with the highest casting cost. If there are some creatures that are tied for the highest casting cost, then you get to choose the one that you don't mind getting rid of. Then you do the same for artifacts. And the interesting part, and it's not really clear from this card, but if you read the Oracle text you will understand, is that you first exchange creatures and then you exchange artifacts, and the same artifact creature can be in the same exchange under the same card, effect exchange 2 times. And this is something to keep in mind. If, for example, you cast Ashnod's Transmigrant on your opponent's creature, and then you take control of it as a creature, but then maybe you will have to give it back to your opponent because it's an artifact too. So that's something to keep in mind. Anyway, if you manage to cast this card using good timing, it can be extremely powerful. It is really underrated. I didn't really understand how powerful it could be. Because, for instance, we can exchange our Sage of Latnam for our opponent's Shivan Dragon, and then exchange our Mox Sapphire for our opponent's Juggernaut. This is very, very powerful, trust me. Also, the good thing about this card, as you can see, is that it doesn't really work as a permanent. Control magic can be disenchanted, clone can be killed, and of course so can be the creature that you steal. But anyway, it's not control magic, it's not Dance of Many, so these cards are not really fragile because it exchanges their control as a sorcery. Then we also have to talk about the Doppelganger. The Doppelganger is just another clone card, as you can see, and clones are pretty good in this deck, as I have said. And another very good thing is that it can be exchanged, it can be changed into any creature you want during your upkeep. This is one of the rare cases, by the way, where I really prefer the white frame, because the white frame here is just, it goes so well together with the pale tones of this card. Of course, it's not a very powerful deck, so it requires some help in order to be at least more or less competitive. And power is a very good addition to this deck, obviously. Ancestral, which is my favorite piece of power, and I always think that it is the most powerful one. Time Walk, which is very good after we steal our opponent's creatures. And Time Twister, which I feel really helps us to get the needed card advantage, because our opponent's best creatures are also our best creatures. So Time Twister is a card that I do not always put into my blue decks, but in this case I think it's definitely justifiable. Of course, there is also Mox, and there is another powerful blue card, which is Brain Geyser or Brain Geyser, and of course it requires a lot of mana, but with this deck we can usually have as much mana as we need if we manage to survive early on. Of course, this deck usually has bad matchups such as very fast aggro, because you really don't want to cast control magic on your opponent's Savannah lines. You will just lose due to them having more tempo than you. And of course, it doesn't usually win against really controlish decks with no creatures, decks that rely on, let's say, direct damage such as Fireball as a finisher and Mishras, because those are very difficult to steal using these effects. The best matchup for this deck, I think, is usually some kind of a mid-range aggro. Then let's talk about Time Vault. Time Vault here, of course, is there just because I like this card. There are no combos whatsoever, as you can see. There is no way to untap it unfairly, but if you know how to use it, then sometimes you can use it to your advantage, because your opponent can overcommit to the board, and then you can steal their creatures or some other permanents, and then you can take the extra turn when you have the board advantage. Then let's talk about the mana base. We've got 4 Mishras, and you should remember that Mishras, if they are activated, they are artifact creatures, which means that we can use them for some kind of exchange, and we can use them for cloning, for mana acceleration, for example. And for those of you who don't know how it works, if it is a creature, if it's an animated land, and you cast a clone, then the clone will just come into play as a copy of this card, so it will be a perfectly normal land that can still be activated. so there is no hassle with it. It will not be like a token creature of some kind that cannot be turned back into the land. There is only one strip mine per Swedish rules, and a lot of lands, 23 islands. This is of course because the deck has a very high mana curve, and very often we cannot do anything until the fourth turn. So turn 4 or turn 3, if we're lucky to get some mana acceleration, is when we can actually start doing something. As for sideboard, I didn't really give a lot of thought to it. We've got 2 Felver Stones, and we've got Phantasmal Terrains to make use of our opponent's islands that we give them, and then use our Lord of Atlantis. Copy artifacts in case our opponent doesn't really have a lot of creatures, and maybe a couple more Sage of Latnam, and also Reverberation, which is a very good way to steal our opponent's spell, such as a sorcery. One of the best uses of this card would be against Earthquake, because with Earthquake all this damage will be multiplied. For instance, if there are 4 creatures and the opponent casts Earthquake for 5, then you will redirect all this damage, and this will be 5 damage for each creature and 5 damage for each player, which will be a total of 30 damage redirected. Of course, this will rarely happen, but if it does, this will be a really nice interaction. So thank you for watching. Of course, I would like to get some ideas from you how this deck can be improved. I know that it's far from being perfect, and I know that this is just my fun choice to play, let's say, Transmigrant instead of some kind of counter magic, and I really wanted to push the theme of stealing our opponent's permanents in this deck. I had a lot of fun and managed to win some games. My win ratio would be maybe around 30%, which is not good at all, but of course for a fun deck I think that's pretty decent. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around with more brews and some more competitive decks as well. Bye!